Okay, well, I think we should go ahead and get started. Good evening. I'm Keisha Rogers, and we want to welcome you to our LaRouche PAC discussion today, which is going to be led by Susan Kokenda. And before I turn it over to Susan, just to give people a sense of why we are holding this discussion, first of all, the title and theme of our discussion tonight is Winning the War to Re-Americanize the US economy, which is absolutely critical right now to understand that, as we discussed earlier this week, we are in the midst of not just winning the battles that we are confronted with, but understanding what the total war is to restoring national sovereignty to our nation. And that's the ultimate battle, ultimate fight at hand right now. And when you think about, I know a lot of people listening to this discussion tonight are looking at the atrocities that are going on against our nation, looking at the fact that our sovereignty, our freedoms have been taken away. People are being denied basic rights, basic economic rights. We're looking at the insane policies coming out of the Biden administration, the fascism that really it should be called right now, when you see how American citizens are being denied access to critical care, while we're being told that we have to be fully vaccinated, wearing masks, while people can come across the southern borders and have all their freedoms given to them, where they're not being required to be masked or be vaccinated or anything else. But this can make people enraged, because you say, well, what's happening to our school systems where critical race theory is being pushed down the throats of our children right now, where if we're not masked and vaccinated, we may be threatened with losing our jobs, if we do have jobs in the first place, in the midst of this total devastation and economic collapse and financial collapse that we're facing right now. And so it's a lot of reasons, from the standpoint of what just happened with the devastation in Afghanistan, and the fact that not that we pulled out, we should have been out from the very beginning. We shouldn't have ever been in there. What did it do to improve the productive powers of labor of our economy, to increase jobs? Well, for the most part, we created more drug addicts. We increased the drug cartels functioning, but we didn't increase the functioning of our infrastructure, of our economy, let alone the economy of the Afghans. And so there's a lot of reasons for people to be irate right now as to what's going on against the nation. But it is important that we understand what this actual battle is about. And the question is that the economic sovereignty of the nation is being destroyed right now. And we have to regain that. We have to take that back. And this is what Lyndon LaRouche understood as the ultimate battle to winning the war, is that once the nation loses its sovereignty to a globalist imperial power, then it was going to be very hard to take the nation back. And so you have to understand, the enemy that you're facing right now is not a political party. It's not people coming across the border or anything else. I mean, these things are all orchestrated right now to keep you away from the real issue, the real fight, should we say, at hand. And to understand that, this question that Susan's going to outline of the American system of political economy is one that all great economists who shaped the foundation of our nation, all great political leaders from Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, John Quincy Adams, Abraham Lincoln, President John F. Kennedy, President Franklin Roosevelt, to President Donald Trump, was the only person within the course of the recent period, outside of the fight that has been waged for decades by economist and statesman Lyndon LaRouche, who understood the importance of the revival of the American system of political economy. And that's why he became such a threat, because he recognized that the real threat was the globalist system that was out to destroy our economy. And that's why they ran a coup against President Donald Trump. And I'm going to share something before I turn it over to Susan here that I found today. I was totally blown away by, because we know that President Trump has made very clear his intentions for restoring the U.S. industry, the super manufacture, to make the United States a superpower, a manufacturing superpower, to revive the productive economy. But that didn't just happen when he came into the presidency. And he was already discussing this as a candidate. And this is why they knew that he was going to be a threat. I'm going to share just a couple of quotes from you that I found from a speech that President Trump gave back in September of 2016, around September 15, 2016, is what it says here. And anyway, he was delivering the speech to the New York Economic Club. And he says, I'm just going to read about what he says his economic program is at that time and what he was aiming for in his presidency. He says, today I'm going to outline a plan for an economic revival. It is a bold, ambitious, forward-looking plan to massively increase jobs, wages, income, and opportunities for the people of our country. He says, my plan will embrace the truth that people flourish under a minimum government burden, and it will tap into the incredible realized potential of our workers and their dreams. This is important because it's going to lead into what Susan is going to discuss. He goes on to say, at the time, right now, 92 million Americans are on the sidelines outside the workforce and not part of our economy. It's a silent nation of jobless Americans. Look no further than the city of Flint, where I just visited. The jobs have stripped from this community, and its infrastructure has collapsed. In 1970, there were more than 80,000 people in Flint, Michigan for GM. Today, it is less than 8,000. Now Ford has announced it is moving all small car productions to Mexico. It used to be cars were made in Flint and you couldn't drink the water in Mexico. Now the cars are made in Mexico and you can't drink the water in Flint. We are going to turn this around. My economic plan rejects the cynicism that says our labor force will keep declining, that our jobs will keep leaving, that our economy can never grow as it did once before. We reject the pessimism that says our standard of living can no longer rise and that all that's left to do is divide up and redistribute our shrinking resources. Everything that is broken today can be fixed, and every failure can be turned into a great success. Jobs can stop leaving our country and start pouring in. Failing schools can become flourishing schools. Crumbling roads and bridges can become gleaming new infrastructure. Intercities can experience a flood of new jobs and investment, and rising crime can give way to the safe and prosperous communities. All of these things and so much more are possible, but to accomplish them, we must replace the present policy of globalism, which has moved so many jobs and so much wealth out of our country, and replace it with a new policy of Americanism. Under the American system, every policy decision we make must pass a simple test. Does it create more jobs and better wages for Americans? So I'll leave it at that. because I think that's a great opening to what Susan is going to take us through tonight. And to address the question of how do we win the war to take back our economy. Okay, Susan, go ahead.
Thanks, Keisha. That's a great quote. And I was going to start out by talking about the fact that our economy is broken. So once again, Donald Trump is ahead of the curve. Because the challenge before us is really to answer concretely with the principles and the policies needed to fix a broken economy. Mr. LaRouche, for many, many years, warned that if you allow the financial parasite to cannibalize your physical economy, the productive capabilities of your workforce, your infrastructure, to shut down your science and technology, that you would eventually come to a breakdown. And most people, when they hear that, they think of a financial breakdown, and we've had our share of those. But he also warned of an actual physical breakdown. And that's where we are today. We see it most prominently, people are experiencing it most prominently in the breakdown of supply chains, which has been brought about by all of the evil policies of globalization, offshoring, outsourcing to cheap labor, just-in-time production, the degradation of our infrastructure, and this has left us where you can see that literally our economy is no longer working. One of the most well-known examples is what people are seeing in the headlines in terms of the chip shortage and how this is affecting the auto industry and shutting down many, many, many auto plants for weeks, if not months at a time. Now, we don't produce any, well, I want to use this as an example of what is so completely wrong and crazy with the underlying method by which we look at economics and where we have to turn, both in terms of principles and in terms of an example of how to reverse it and fix it. Look, one of the centerpieces of Mussolini Joe's green energy policy, Green New Deal, is electric vehicles. Now, everybody knows that, again, we have a chip shortage here in the United States. If you take a gasoline-powered vehicle today, I've seen estimates that it's anywhere from 30 chips, or if it's got all sorts of bells and whistles like, automatic parking and the best entertainment system on the planet and so on, it can go up to 150 chips. How many chips do you think are in an electronic vehicle, which Biden and his merry band of lunatics want us to move to entirely by some not too far distant time in the future? 3,000 chips per car in an electronic vehicle, and we can't produce the chips now. Now, one would assume that this would be taken into account. Well, perhaps you say it is, because finally, there is the prospect of a chip manufacturing facility being built in the United States. Right now, all of our chips, of course, come from overseas. Many of them come from Taiwan. Well, where are the great geniuses of our free market system considering building a chip plant? In Phoenix, Arizona. One of the main components for chips is water. Well, if you've noticed recently, there's a drought with no end in sight and a discussion of water rationing. On top of that, look at the materials that go into chips. One of them is nickel. The United States is very low on the totem pole in terms of the production of nickel. In fact, we have only one nickel mine in the United States. It's in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, and the estimates are it'll play out by 2025 or 2026. There's one other plant on the drawing board, but of course it's being held up by objections, environmental, regulatory, and so on. So stop and think. Here you have a Biden collective which wants to move toward electric vehicles wants to move away from internal combustion engines. And yet they're in la-la land in terms of the physical capacity to ever do that based on anything going on in the United States and not being totally vulnerable to the disruption of supply lines, which we've seen. There's something wrong here in the way that we conduct our economics. And as I say, it is broken. It's broken in its current form. It's not going to get fixed by the dogmas of the Keynesian dogmas that the Democrats embrace, nor is it going to get fixed by the monetarist and free market dogmas that the Republicans and Wall Street embrace. As Keisha and Donald Trump just referenced, it's going to get fixed when we return to the American system, which was invented by Alexander Hamilton in the 18th century, reinvented and practiced by Abraham Lincoln and Franklin Roosevelt in the next 2 centuries, and put on a scientific basis by Lyndon LaRouche throughout his life in the 20th century and into the 21st century. It's an American system which is arrayed against the British system of monetarism, globalization, the insane green ideology. And this is going to be the subject of not only our upcoming class series on re-Americanizing the US economy, but also a campaign and initiatives that we intend to launch to make this the centerpiece of the fight that has to be waged in the United States. I want to put it in some other terms. I'm going to share the screen with you because Mr. LaRouche did a absolutely delightful discussion of what the American system is. And this just is a screenshot. You can find this on our website under the section of the website where we feature videos from Mr. LaRouche, not capitalist nor communist. We are the American system. And in the course of the class series, which is going to be launched next week, we'll be looking at the different elements of how to organize our economy to be able to constantly increase its physical output, to increase its capital intensivity, increase the productivity and standard of living of the population, just as Donald Trump said in those quotes which Keisha read at the beginning, to improve our infrastructure, or as Mr. LaRouche discussed it, and as we've discussed it in different classes, uplift the actual physical platform upon which we conduct our economics, and drive all of that with science and technology. Now, throughout his life, Lyndon LaRouche was always coming up with metaphors to get across the underlying dynamic principle, which has to drive your thinking, whether it's economic policy, strategic policy, scientific policy. He always knew that he always tried to communicate. It's not a formula. It's not a dogma. It's not some kind of structure. It is a living, dynamic idea. And one of the metaphors that he used throughout his life is the metaphor that he described, or the principle he described as the machine tool principle, the intersection between the discovery of a new idea and its actualization in the productive process. And I again want to share the screen with you and share a quote from him in which he discusses, I think very beautifully, the machine tool process. He says, when you're dealing with science, scientific discovery, when you discover an idea, you've got to prove it's true. How can you prove it's right? How can you prove it in nature? You construct what's called a crucial or proof of principle experiment to prove that nature works the way your discovery says it works. That's called a machine tool principle. Now, when you take the apparatus which you use to construct that experiment, you walk over to a guy who designs machine tools. This guy, having seen your experimental device, he probably helped you build it, says, look, I can design a whole group of new kinds of products and new kinds of machine tools on the basis of the discovery which you demonstrated. And that's the way it works. You combine the development of the mind with the development of the products and processes which the mind's discovery of principle has devised. And that's called scientific and technological progress. Now, he wrote this in a book called The Economics of the, no, this was actually a presentation he gave in 1997. But he discussed this in many, many different venues. And what I want to do this evening is take what I think is one of the greatest examples of this principle in our history, in recent history, and that is the industrial mobilization that in the 18 months prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor, which laid the basis for what came in the ensuing years after we were actually drawn into the war. And I would argue that this 18-month period of time saved mankind from fascism. And it was led by two men who in the 1930s were at political loggerheads with each other, apparently representing two completely contrary ideologies. Those two men were President Franklin Roosevelt and ultimately the president of General Motors, William Knudsen, who was known as Bill Knudsen or Big Bill Knudsen by many, who came together in May of 1940 in an extraordinary kind of partnership, which laid the basis for the United States to mobilize such that we had the ability to defeat fascism. And I would argue that the two of them shared an understanding, whether it was explicit or implicit, in both the American system and the machine tool principle, which Mr. LaRouche discussed. And I would also argue that when you look at the apparent contradiction of their two so-called ideologies, you look at the New Deal on the one hand, and you look at corporate America on the other. Again, in standard political parlance, they were definitely, and in actuality, they were at loggerheads. But I think that if you look at both from a different standpoint, you'll understand how this amazing partnership could come about. Because if you look at Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, it wasn't all the American system. There were parts of it that didn't work. There were parts of it which had a bad effect on the US economy. But if you look at the parts of the New Deal, which were a reflection of the American system, those were the parts which improved the physical productivity of the nation and uplifted the physical productivity of the population. Programs like the Tennessee Valley Authority, perhaps the premier example of the American system, but the Civilian Conservation Corps, which gave hundreds of thousands and millions of people the skills that they needed, rural electrification, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which made sure that credit was available for the necessary development of various kinds of economic activity. And the other side of the New Deal that was a reflection of the American system, of course, was the degree to which Roosevelt was able to rein in Wall Street and the speculators, with the premier element of that being the passage of Glass-Steagall, which cut off the speculators from the commercial banks, left them to rot on their own, and established a stable commercial banking system which could help to provide credit for real economic growth in the United States. That was the part of the New Deal that was the American system. Now go look at the American corporate world that Bill Knudsen came from. It wasn't all the American system either. Obviously, you had Wall Street, you had people like the Rockefellers and the Harrimans and the Morgans, but you also had the builders and the innovators. And one of the clear examples of the tension between the builders and Wall Street was Henry Ford, who at one point had to buy out the Dodge brothers, who were shareholders in the Ford Motor Company, because they just wanted the profits. And he wanted to take the profits and plow them into constantly increasing his production. At the time he did that is when he wanted to expand to the Highland Park plant, which was the first assembly line ever built. So he just bought them out and got rid of them. And his antipathy toward Wall Street was legendary, also toward the British and also toward Roosevelt, which caused a few problems a little bit later. But again, this is the tension between an American system outlook and the Wall Street outlook. And what I would say is that it was the American system elements of both Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal and American industry, which came together in the war mobilization. And what I hope to do is give you a sense of how that actually functioned tonight. So let's start with the state of the country in 1939, 1940, as war was breaking out in Europe. After World War I, we had pretty much completely demobilized and shut down most of our defense capabilities, such that in these years prior to World War II, we were 17th in the world in terms of our military. Countries like Argentina, Holland, and Hungary had bigger military capabilities than we did. We had a total of 1,500 planes in the military, and this included trainers and biplanes. Hitler was flying 1,500 planes a day in the early part of the war in Europe. We were only building 4 ships a month. At the end of World War I, we had gotten up to, the Ford Motor Company built the Eagle boat subchaser. And by the time armistice was signed, they were producing 1 per day. But that was demobilized, and now we were producing 4 a month nationwide. The Chief of Staff of the Army, General Marshall, knew what a dangerous situation we were in, and alerted President Roosevelt in a meeting. He wasn't supposed to be called on, but he was so intent on sounding the alarm that he butted in the meeting. And you're going to see a number of these illustrations here. These are pictures I took a couple of years ago. There was a wonderful exhibit pulled together by the World War II Museum, which is down in Louisiana. And it was a traveling exhibit, and I had a chance to see it at the Yankee Air Museum here in Ypsilanti, Michigan, which was the site of the Willow Run bomber plant. And I took a lot of pictures. It was sort of a poster exhibit, as you'll see. And it renewed my interest in the question of the war mobilization, an interest I've always had because my parents did meet at Willow Run building bombers. But this really re-sparked my interest in the mobilization, and particularly the role of Knudsen. But in a meeting in May of 1940, General Marshall, you'll see at the bottom, butted in to warn that if 5 German divisions landed anywhere on the coast, they could go anywhere they wished. Nobody could stop them. That was a warning that he repeated many, many times. It wasn't just the state of the military per se, but in terms of our industry itself, we were functioning at woefully low levels. The steel industry in 1939 was at its lowest capacity in 20 years. So it was even lower than during the depths of the Depression. The initial estimates of the aluminum that we were going to need just for preliminary buildup, we were only producing 1/4 of what we would need for a preliminary buildup. And I want for a moment to stop and address that question of aluminum and take you back to one of the critical elements of Roosevelt's policies, and that is the Tennessee Valley Authority. Because if we had not invested in the major infrastructure or platform building capabilities like the Tennessee Valley Authority and the dams out in the western part of the United States, you would not have had the electricity you needed to provide for war production, in particular for aluminum, which is a highly energy intensive metal to actually work with. So Roosevelt himself, I think, knew how serious the situation was, but Marshall simply underscored it in that warning. And so shortly after that, Roosevelt went to a close advisor of his, longtime friend, Bernard Baruch, who had actually been tapped to lead the war mobilization in World War I. Far too little too late, and that mobilization really didn't get off the ground until pretty much the armistice was signed, and everybody knew that. So Roosevelt went to Baruch to ask him to take the job again. And Baruch declined, and you'll see at the bottom, because he said he was too old, you'll see at the bottom of this poster when Roosevelt asks Baruch who are the three top production people in the country who should be considered for this immense task. Baruch said, first Knudsen, second Knudsen, and third Knudsen. And President Roosevelt listened, got Knudsen on the phone, and on May 28th, 1940, invited him to come to Washington, D.C. to be part of the war production effort. Now, what was it about Knudsen that Baruch and others knew? I'm going to quote from Jesse Jones, who was the head of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation and had been head of it for quite a long time, including during the Hoover years. So he did know his way around American industry. And what he said about Knudsen is he said, he seemed to carry in his head a picture of the whole manufacturing business of the United States. And Jones went on to say he also had in his head the phone numbers of all the corporate heads, and he knew which plants, whether it was a steel plant or an auto plant or a chemical plant or a clothing plant, could be enlarged or had to be enlarged or just retooled to fulfill a particular function in the war mobilization. Knudsen had come to the United States in 1900 as a 21-year-old immigrant from Denmark with the proverbial shirt on his back. What is known about his background isn't a lot, but he seemed to have been raised in a large but family which was able to provide for itself. He had a decent education. Apparently, he excelled in mathematics and history and languages. There's something about the Danish education system, perhaps at that time, because one of the other production geniuses of the 20th century, Charlie Sorensen, Ford's production manager, was also had come from Denmark as well. But after Knudsen arrived in the United States, it wasn't long before his skills were recognized, and he ended up playing a significant role at a plant in Buffalo, which built bicycles and also got into auto parts manufacturing, which caught the eye of Henry Ford, who ultimately bought the entire company, and also brought Knudsen to Detroit to be part of the Ford Motor Company, where he played a critical role both in the World War I mobilization, and one of the few companies that actually did manage to turn anything out of any use in time was Ford with the Eagle boat, and Knudsen was part of that. And he also played a critical role in the development of the Highland Park plant, the first assembly line, which Ford launched after getting rid of the Dodge brothers and having the freedom to go spend his money on actually building things. Now, I want to take a step back and I want to look at Lyndon LaRouche. During this same period of the 1930s, well, let me jump ahead a little bit. At a certain point, Knudsen did not get along with Henry Ford. They were both very strong-willed. and he moved over to General Motors. So by the 1930s, he was playing a prominent role, first as head of the Chevy division and then as president of GM. But as I said, I want to take a certain step back and take a look at Lyndon LaRouche during the 1930s. Now, Lyndon LaRouche was born in 1922. So I want to acquaint those of you who may not be familiar with this with a story that many of us heard many, many, many times. And I managed to find a place where it's actually written down in one of his articles. But I think it's a very interesting mirror to look into, or a window to look through, as we think about this question of the machine tool process and the culture, or at least some of the culture in the United States at that time. This is a discussion that Mr. LaRouche has about his first year of high school geometry. So since he was born in 1922, I guess this would make it 1935, 36, something like that. This he does write down in a book called The Economics of the Noosphere. He says, take as an example my rejection of the first year of high school geometry from about the first day of class. Earlier, I had observed carefully the structures seen during my not infrequent visits to the Boston Navy Yard and recognized that the holes made in the steel beams made the structures stronger by eliminating the burden of weight, not essential to the function of supporting the structure itself. Why should people concerned with the strength of the structures they had constructed make those holes in the relevant beams? I decided that knowing the kind of geometry required for this use of materials represented some principle to be mastered and discovered. So when the teacher challenged the members of the geometry class to identify the useful purpose for studying geometry, I referred to the effect of making those holes in the beams. One cuts out the holes to make the structure stronger. There must be some reason why circular or approximately circular holes had been chosen. Now, he goes on to say that he was ridiculed by some teachers, by other students, and so on, whose approach was not that you study geometry to understand better how the world works, but you study geometry to learn the axioms and the postulates and to be able to pass the test, and so on and so forth. I want to tell that story because I think it captures the two worlds that we're dealing with. We're dealing with the machine tool world of physical production, of principles that will affect the real universe. And then, as it has frankly engulfed our society for most of the last decades, you're living in an artificial construct of a world of money, or as Mr. LaRouche was resisting, Euclidean geometry, of formulas, of dogmas, which have no coherence with the way that the world really works. And it was the industrialists like Knudsen and the leaders like Roosevelt who knew that they had to get a job done in the real world. And there was no room for ideologies or political spats. Now, the spats between General Motors and the New Deal were pretty legendary, and Knudsen was right in the middle of it. There was not much, if anything, of the New Deal that he liked. Of course, this was the period of unionization. So, of course, the tensions between the auto unions and GM were also legendary. And when Roosevelt called Knudsen to have him come to Washington, the first thing Knudsen did is he went to Alfred P. Sloan, the head of General Motors, to tell him he was resigning his extremely lucrative job and answering the call of the president. And Sloan thought he was crazy. He said, you know, Roosevelt, why are you doing this? Roosevelt hates you, or you hate Roosevelt. they're going to eat you alive. And Knudsen simply said, my president has called me. This country has given me everything that anyone could ever ask for, and I'm answering the call. On the other hand, there were a lot of radical New Dealers who certainly did not want Bill Knudsen anywhere near the Roosevelt administration or the war mobilization. But what is really interesting is that in all the critical spats, especially in the 18-month period from May 1940 up through the end of 41, which is when we entered the war, in almost every critical instance, Roosevelt backed Knudsen's position because he recognized that it was going to be impossible to do what needed to be done without the machine tool genius of Knudsen. And I'm going to share again a fairly famous picture, which you might have already seen in the email that we sent out. But this is Knudsen, I assume, accepting or the position or meeting Roosevelt for the first time. Now, drawing on his experience from World War I and others' experience, Knudsen knew it was going to take 18 months to retool and tool up so that actual production could start. And this question of machine tools was absolutely central to what happened during this period. I have a couple of quotes from Knudsen, which I think just really capture it. This is one of my favorites. He says, people seem to think that if you get the money on the 1st of July, that by the 15th, the guns are sprouting right out of the ground. It takes a year at the very least with overtime, and with overtime, 10 months to tool for an airplane motor. It takes a little over a year to tool for a medium tank. Our problem is first to get the best skill for the particular piece. Second, to get facilities where facilities are required as quickly as possible. Third, to Shanghai the machine tools we need. And fourth, to sit down and pray to God that everything will be running all right. This is something he said in July of 1940. And then a couple of months later, he said it in another way. The absolute indispensable factor is speed. We need, particularly during the tooling period, all the effort you can give us. The builder, the machine manufacturer and engineer. We need your strength as have never needed it before. And after we get the tools, the machines will turn out the stuff. The American worker fundamentally loves to see the shop run. If we can get him tooled up right, he will produce the stuff. Of course, Knudsen was not alone. One of the leader, the head of the Machine Tool Builders Association and the president of the Cincinnati Mining Company also knew this. And in fact, he knew, he began tooling up before the official establishment of these war mobilization organizations in Washington, D.C. I enjoyed the description on this part of the exhibit because I think it gives people a very good sense of who may not be that familiar with thinking through the manufacturing process. This says, as you can see toward the top, the key to building planes, tanks, guns, ships, jeeps, and trucks on assembly lines and factory floors would be machine tools. Tools that grind, bore, stamp, cut, bend, mill, shape, and mold metals to create machines. Depending on the job, a machine tool might range from the size of a toaster to a house. And Knudsen turned to Fred Geer, I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce his name, asking him to double and redouble American machine tool production. Geer looks like an interesting person. It says that he read Latin and Greek fluently. And by the end of the war, his company was producing a new machine tool every 17 minutes. And again, without this, we would not have been in a position to carry out the mobilization that won the war. I I want to just give a couple of examples of how this kind of rough and tumble process of getting the mobilization moving took place in especially 1940, which was the critical period to kickstart it, and how the auto industry, because of the density of machine tool capability in it, almost often ended up being the go-to industry for some of the most urgent needs. One of them was the need to produce an airplane engine. The British had a very good engine. It was called the Merlin engine, built by Rolls-Royce, which they needed for Spitfire fighters. But England was very steel starved. So while they could build planes, they couldn't build the engines themselves. So they came to the United States and went to Knudsen and the others in the War Mobilization Board and said they needed 6,000 engines. We wanted 3,000. So Knudsen immediately thought of the Ford Motor Company as the company to do it. And initially Edsel Ford, who was then president, agreed that Ford would build these Rolls-Royce engines. But remember, Henry Ford didn't like Roosevelt and he didn't like the British, and he never got over it. So he nixed the deal because he wasn't going to help Roosevelt and he wasn't going to help the British. I mean, Edsel was mortified, but there was nothing he could do about it. So Knudsen turned to the Packard Motor Car Company. And I mean, the degree to which the ability to turn on a dime was so natural to these people. On June 24th, after Ford nixed the deal, he calls the head of Packard, gets him and his engineers in there. 2 days later, they're in Washington, D.C., getting the specifications. The next day, June 27th, they're back in Detroit, laying out the plans for a whole new wing to build this engine. They had to get the blueprints from Ford, which had been delivered by the British in a very secret mission, because this was a very advanced engine. And so the blueprints arrived in a crate the size of a freight car. And of course, the specifications were all in English units, not American units, which they had to change, and still fit the tolerance levels needed for mass production, which is 1/10,000th of an inch. But 5 days after they got the call from Knudsen, their vice president for engineering announced, I outlined the engineering plans which would be necessary for us to carry out the manufacturing of Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. And within a year, they were mass producing them 3 times faster than the piecework methods being used by the British. And by the end of the war, they had built 55,000 of these engines, some for Britain, but many for the United States. They ended up being the engines used in the PT boats and in the P-51 Mustang, which was the most effective fighter in World War II. And it was like natural for these people to be able to turn on a dime. One more example I want to use is Chrysler and tanks. In August of 1940, the British were knocking on our doors. And, you know, this is not the place to go through the history of how we ended up in World War II and how the British created Hitler as a marcher lord against the Soviets, watched him turn into a Frankenstein monster, and found themselves fighting him and turning to the United States for support. That's a story for another time. But so of course they're in the United States constantly, asking for materiel. And one of the things they wanted was tanks. They wanted 1,000 tanks per month. So that would be in addition to whatever we wanted. And at the time, in August 1940, nationwide, we were producing 13 tanks a month. And we're talking about the need for thousands. So Knudsen and others are sitting there with Army officials and the British, and the Army officials think, well, maybe we can go to Baldwin locomotives because I guess they build big things. And Knudsen intervened and said, what about a car company? And they all looked at him. Well, they've never built tanks before. And he says to his assistant, get me Detroit. And right there in the room, he gets the head of Chrysler on the phone, KT Keller. And he says, KT, I've got a problem. We have to make more tanks than any corporation has done in the past. Can you do it? And KT says, sure. When do we meet? And shortly after that, Keller and his engineers were in Rock Island, Illinois, looking at the M3 tank. First, they were told to look at the blueprints, and he said, no, I need to look at the tank. And realized there were various design mistakes. But the biggest problem was the difficulty and the enormous time it was going to take to drill holes through 2-inch steel plate for the rivets, because the Army design had everything riveted in the tanks. And Knudsen and others said, well, why don't we weld it? And the Army said, impossible, it can never be done. So needless to say, they immediately proved that it could be done. In fact, Knudsen took 2 welded pieces of steel together with him to Washington, D.C. to show people that it could be done, and that revolutionized tank production. That became the basis for both the Grant tank and then the more famous Sherman tank. And it also saved a lot of lives, because when you had rivets in the tank, if the tank was hit by artillery or anything else and those rivets came loose, they were like projectiles inside that. I'm not really going to talk about the most famous production story, which is the Liberator bombers at Willow Run, because it's very, very famous. Just sort of to give one more snapshot into the mind of these people who thought from the standpoint of machine tools and industrial processes. The way the idea of Willow Run, the design of Willow Run, came about because once Ford did accept the contract for the Liberators, and the old man grudgingly came around to the fact that we had to fight this war and the Ford Motor Company had to do something about it. Ford's production manager, Sorensen, went out to California to Consolidated Aircraft, which was building Liberator bombers one at a time. And each one was different because it was, each one was constructed like, piecework. And he asked to be given a tour of the whole facility, took notes, extensive notes, went back to his hotel, sat and started sketching out on, I think it was napkins, and had the floor completely covered with the entire production process it would take to set up an assembly line for the Liberator bomber, flew back to Ypsilanti, and that became the basis for the Liberators. And of course, it's one of the most famous production stories of all of World War II, the fact that they built one Liberator bomber every 57 minutes at the peak of production. Now, there was one other element to this incredible process, and that was the financing and the economics for this, because it was not always the case that you were going to get Wall Street financing for a prototype which might ultimately not be chosen by the US government. And this is where the question of where the Reconstruction Finance Corporation came in again. One of the people that Knudsen worked most closely with was Jesse Jones of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. And industrialists knew that if they had a handshake from Knudsen, they knew the next thing he was going to be on the phone with Jesse Jones, and the financing, the credit would be forthcoming. And one of the things Jones was very, very proud of is that everything that the Reconstruction Finance Corporation issued as credit and loans ended up getting paid back to the US government. So much of what was done was not done through appropriations. There were appropriations, but a lot of the capital that was needed to build up the plants and do the retooling and carry out the mission was classic American system credit through the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. So there were other things that Knudsen had to do in terms of changing amateurization, periods of time, and other ways of ensuring that these companies that were going into new areas, they didn't know if they were going to succeed or they were going to fail. They didn't know if their design was going to be chosen. You know, he had to impress upon people in the administration that you had to have an economic structure such that these industries would be able to survive this process, you know, of experimental design, of perhaps not getting, you know, a contract and so on. And Roosevelt, in every single instance, listened to him and realized that these kinds of things were the kinds of things that had to be done if we were going to have this marriage of the mission of tooling up the United States for war production so that we could defeat the enemy of mankind, the marriage between what the government could provide in terms of organization, guidance, credit, and what the ingenuity of American industry could provide. And he recognized, as I say, even though there was a lot of opposition to Knudsen, and ultimately he was forced out of the war production positions he was in right after Pearl Harbor by some of his opponents in the administration. But Roosevelt immediately made him a lieutenant general in the Army, the only time in history a civilian ever entered the military at that rank, and put him in charge of production for the Army itself. And of course, he continued in that extraordinary role right through the end of the war. What I want to reflect on as in conclusion is the lessons of this, or maybe the lesson, how we didn't do this. I want to share with people one of the references I used extensively for this. It's a book called Freedom's Forge by a man named Arthur Herman. And it's a very, very enjoyable book. He's done extensive research. Of course, a lot of the research is also based on the biography of William Knudsen himself by Norman Beasley. But there's a bias to this book, which you see in the subhead, the subtitle of the book, How American Business Produced Victory in World War II. And of course, it's only half of the story. It is half of the story, but it's only half of the story. But there's an even worse bias that comes from the Wall Street Journal. And this is a lesson in how we didn't accomplish this war mobilization. The book has the following review from the Wall Street Journal on the very front of the book. It says, a rambunctious book that is itself alive with the animal spirits of the marketplace. Well, that is not how we won. And I don't think, and I know that it's not the way William Knudsen thought about it either, because I want to conclude with a quote from him, which shows that he is not very much in keeping with the idea of the animal spirits of the marketplace. He says, reams of paper and miles of film have been wasted preaching what is called rugged individualism. I've never found such a specimen in my experience. If I found a successful manufacturer, the reason was generally that he had succeeded in building up an organization whose confidence and loyalty he had earned. I know of a steel plant in Sweden, which has been in existence for 600 years. The reason for this is not somebody's rugged individualism 600 years ago, but simply a good product and a good organization to carry on. So what Franklin Roosevelt, Jesse Jones, Knudsen, the people who built the Tennessee Valley Authority, these are people who had a mission, and they didn't have time for dogmas. They didn't have time for doctrines. They didn't have time for political fights. I mean, believe me, political fights went on, but the people who were at the head of this mobilization and this effort, they were singularly united around the mission of rebuilding this nation so we could free the world from fascism. And they built something which then ended up getting, used up in the war. Now, as Mr. LaRouche often spoke about, Roosevelt's intention, had he lived, was to take this awesome industrial capability, retool it for export production for the rest of the world, in a world in which imperialism was ended, which he had told Winston Churchill in some of their final summits. That is, Winston, we did not fight this war to reestablish British 18th century methods. Roosevelt died in 1945. He was replaced by what Mr. LaRouche called a very little man, Harry Truman, who was a puppet of the British. And we did not get rid of British 18th century methods. So the British Empire, the French Empire, the Dutch Empire continued for decades and decades. And rather than the United States being not the arsenal of democracy, but the engine for the development of these the colonial world, that colonial world stayed colonial, and we dismantled most of this powerful capability, or it atrophied over the subsequent decades. And what we're faced with today, the challenge that we're faced with today, is not to build up our economy so that we can fight a war, as had to be done in 1940. But the challenge we're faced with today is to rescue the very bare bones of this economy that's itself, but to do it using precisely the same principles and precisely the same methods that were used so magnificently in the early buildup of the war. The intersection of the machine tool principle and the American system. And that is where what we have to resurrect again today, and again, get rid of this completely false, idiotic battle, so-called battle between the government and industry. The issue is not who's doing what. The issue is, what is it that you're trying to do? Are you trying to, as Donald Trump said in that quote that Keisha quoted at the beginning, are you trying to build up our manufacturing, create gleaming infrastructure, provide a better standard of living for your population? If that's your mission, then your tool is the American system and the machine tool principle. And we hope over the coming weeks that this will become much more alive for people, and that we can take the challenge of resurrecting this out to the American people and make this the centerpiece of the fight that we have to wage if we are going to re-Americanize the US economy and not only pull us out of the globalist system, but be a force for destroying that globalist system once and forever. So I've enjoyed telling this story to you because it's near and dear to my heart. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I'm more than happy to open it up for questions.